Confessions of a Hairapist. My name is Ashley. Thank you for coming to my space. Welcome and happy day. I say Hairapist because for about 17 years that I've been behind the chair, that's more or less the most fulfilling description of what I do. I absolutely do hair. It's a skill, a talent, and there's also skills and talents that because I could do both at once, they mesh together. So listening, and whether you mean to or not, it's listening, giving out advice, holding space, sharing wisdom, lending an ear, a shoulder, being in any kind of service to help the person sort of feel better, find beauty, feel relief. And a lot of times, one of the most coined things I hear all the time was like, oh, there she is again. Like there's something about the experience, and likely beyond the hair, but like something about the experience that makes you feel refreshed and back to yourself. So I didn't necessarily intend on being a hairstylist my whole entire life. My family owned a construction company, and so I was really into drafting and design and thought that like architecture was more in my realm. Long story short, I found my way into hair because I had this incredible hairstylist that did everybody in my family. So truth be told, she was more of like my Hairapist. And she knew everything that was going on in our family, business-wise. She knew that I was in process of getting my general contracting license to work with my dad. And she was like, you know what you should do? You should be a hairstylist. And it was warranted in the fact that like I asked a lot of questions. I was really intrigued. I really technically knew I was an artist, but I didn't know, I had not expressed it ever before. So she was like, you have to go to hair school. So I go and check out Paul Mitchell, the school in Orlando. And immediately the whole environment's completely different than where I grew up. My environment was a lot more, let's just say for the sake of, it was a lot more, emotions weren't necessarily a good thing. Vulnerability wasn't an option. And especially in the construction world, it's a lot more aggressive or more just, In hair, you touch people, you share, you connect. And it started with the people that were in my class and the other hairstylists that were future day makers or future professional. And they gave us words like visionary, and they taught us to draw and write in color. And in order to memorize something, you could make a song out of it. And a lot of the other people that were there, we all had a sort of similarity in whether we had our own pain that we were trying to overcome with beauty, or we felt drawn to this because of the human connection, or just also genuinely good at like the art itself. So I start making really great friends. We start kind of discussing, and or I'm sort of introduced to the idea that these friendships could be a lot more than what I was used to. The way that we can connect would be really authentic and vulnerable. And I had one friend in particular who used to feed back to me and say, you know, this is what you're doing, this is how you're making me feel. And I was like, whoa, no one's really ever necessarily done that. But because I genuinely wanted to be a good friend and love this person, technically how they felt best at being loved, I took their information and started to work on myself. And she was gentle and graceful enough to explain to me that kind of what I had going on was these patterns that I was unaware of. And she was in some way, shape, or form, she was like a pastor's wife at a church. And I had already went down the road of Christianity in order to sort of like find ease and relief from the experiences I had as like a young adult and as a child. Excuse me. And it's not that it didn't offer relief. I just was like really a lot more curious. And in this realm, it wasn't offering enough space for curiosity. So I get behind the chair and I start immediately noticing things that I was learning about myself I could see in other people. And so my girlfriend had advised that there was like a seminary school nearby that you could do counseling at for like whatever you can afford. And at the time I had really nothing. Like I was just getting by at school and trying to really get through the process and take as much information as I possibly can, because we had like a lot of extracurricular stuff to do. So like keeping a job was, I just like went through a lot of jobs because hair was like focus, primary priority. And so I go to the seminary counseling situation and I start learning about like how my relationship with my parents affect my behavior, how that, you know, everything kind of just starts like piling on. And I'm like very curious that like this entire time, no one's really ever taught me any of this information. And so it's very easy to start using the information with the people that I spend a lot of time with closely. And it was like, this is offering me relief. Maybe this can offer you some type of relief. So as much as a Hairapist makes sense, I also really like appreciate the fact that there's a scientist in me. There's a desire, an enthusiasm to study. So I also feel like it's human research to take the information that you've learned and apply it while you have this experience where people are being very intimate, very vulnerable, and just without really invitation, open up and tell you a lot about them unsolicitedly. And while there is truth that some people are just like randomly, erratically telling you lies, there's also some people who later have said that they've switched hairstylists because they've overshared on a visit. And that's normal. Like I personally overshare sometimes behind the chair. When you feel a connection and you feel like your story is going to help somebody, it's easy to get overwhelmed and share. In a way, this idea of my space and sharing it is so that I can clear that out, share the lessons and teachings that I understand, and not necessarily do it to like an unsuspecting guest. Whereas like the past experiences with my clients, they've always said that the majority of the relationship is a relationship. Hair is just a bonus. And I've really been wanting to lean into that side of it a lot more because it brings me so much joy. The 17 years that I've been doing hair, I have absolutely invested in my continued education in hair a lot, big investment, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of travel. Usually those classes did have like an element of personal development to them. So, but equally, I have really invested in personal development, and it's things like counseling, therapy, retreats, coaches, mentors, these sort of things. And I think all of them, they're not all telling the same story or all teaching the same thing, but there's really important threads that just link all of them together. And it kind of came to me one day of like, what necessarily could be missing in this world that I would have wanted to have seen when I'm going through this process. And I am not the type of person that really just like takes one thing and then just goes for it. Even though it's kind of funny that I've been doing hair for this long, I would have never thought I would have been in a career for such a consecutive period of time. But the truth is I've tried a bunch of things in between, and that really is the defining character of really who I am. I like variety. I like change. I like challenge. It's a weird thing to say out loud, but I'm not necessarily trying to really master only one thing. I'd like to master how much I can understand about multiple things and then make them all sort of connect, and how they esoterically are something that I can understand for myself and something that I know helps impact a lot of parts of my life. So when I do any type of self-study, or when I was realizing in this human research experience of being a Hairapist behind the chair, is that we're all looking for a sense of relief. But how can you find relief for something that you're not honestly and actually even sure of what it is, how it works, and like what necessarily is making it feel broken, or what you can't get relief from? And it was like very obvious that we needed to understand ourselves before we can move on and understand multiple other, being happy, for instance. It's really challenging to be happy if you don't know exactly really how you work. For instance, just simply, one of the things that's making me the most happy right now is really integrating, accepting, and leaning into the fact that I like variety and that the sustainability of that also means that it's time for me to, like, as much as I love and I'm passionate about being the student aspect of the teachings that I'm learning, it's throughout every text, basically, you have to teach it in order to learn it more. And so this is only why it's a teacher in training, and that I even think I have any kind of accolades, if that's the right word, of what information that I have, how it sort of fits and feels with the world. Because I can't necessarily say that I'd love to go out and get testimonies from all my clients, but there's a lot of impacting things that the antidotes that are spread across different teachings really offer to each individual situation. I think that when we go on the spiritual journey, maybe oftentimes, like in our life, we really just kind of fixate on one thing, but a lot of different teachings have a variety that can be applied to your particular experience. And it's in a way, like, imagine, I just took a yoga philosophy course, and it was talking about the Vedas. And when you really understand the Vedas in some just basic way, you can almost see that all of the religions have, like, their version of it. So if God, source, whatever, were to come to the planet, the reality is that, like, how people do it in Florida, how people do it in Wyoming, how people do it in India and Africa and Australia, they all do it differently. So the information needs to be presented differently. It needs to land with you in a different way. And another important aspect is this is for a self-learner. It's really, I think it's important to understand that when you're a self-learner, it doesn't mean, for me, it had in the past, I would get a teacher, and then whatever text they were teaching from, I would get my own and I would read it, and then find that when the teacher was teaching a particular concept, I already had some baseline understanding of it that they were able to elaborate on. Fourth Way, for instance, talks about the influences of different teachings, whether it be like A influence, B influence, or C influence. Whereas like A influence is like something where you see it on Instagram, it's like a symbol of something. It's like, yep, that means something. B influence of teachings would be, going into a church and then maybe even like a little bit more seminary based. C influence would be just, these aren't perfect explanations, but really working with the teacher one-on-one, somebody who has the wisdom and understanding that you want to engage in. And so it becomes a more verbal, not really lecture, but it becomes like a verbal teaching. So I think that the verbal teaching feels really good when you work with a teacher, to not necessarily be like, this is what I have going on in my life, what do I do with it? But in a way of how can there's very practical tools for personal self-development throughout multiple teachings. And the teachings could be human design, which is really popular right now, astrology, which is always popular, gene keys, Fourth Way, which is a very rare, not very talked about teaching. There's A Course in Miracles, there's yoga philosophy, there's Christianity, there's a bunch of different ways to go about how you're going to find the path to your own self-discovery. And personally, I find that sometimes it can be just really overwhelming as to like what to do, when to do it next. And if you just have some concepts to kind of chew on, you could kind of find yourself really drawn to what's going to really speak to you, and where you could dive into like what you think could be the path of self-discovery. So when I'm working with people behind the chair and they have we all have heartbreak, we all have shame, we all have guilt, we all have pain, we all have mourning, we all have money issues, we all have sex, and we all face death. And how each person can grapple and contemplate and essentially come to peace with, accept, and be in relief around a topic could be very, very different on how you hear something and you can apply it directly to yourself. And I would say, without a doubt, having a very varied teaching and being in a position where people are vulnerable and open to meet and open to receive most of the time, I can really find the right analogy or articulation to spark an interest of you getting a little bit more curious. So it's sometimes, in a way, just asking the right questions. And what if all spirituality and all teachings were really just asking the right questions? And a lot of the question is, who am I, what am I, and where do I come from? And that really can just continue on with what things are getting in my way. How can I see and have better relationships in my life? How can I understand myself more? Why would I even want to understand myself more? That is a huge, important question that only you would know. And it's become more and more clear to me that not everyone's asking that question. So this is why this is just not for everyone. And sometimes somebody would tell me before that when I would basically like doing their hair, they were getting a philosophy, or they were getting more than what they asked for. They weren't looking for those big questions and really digging beneath the surface. So that's okay. That's okay. Not everybody has to be in that direction. But I was looking for somebody who was uniquely talking about that direction, not necessarily that it had to be so different than everybody else or everything else, but what could be more encompassing, and so A Course in Miracles to me felt really beautiful, and there's only love and fear, and it felt very love and light. Fourth Way, has a lot more of, we are this sort of mechanical, patterned, programmed machine from the age of beginning to now, and without having any authority over what's happening, like without us noticing, because we're on autopilot, we end up having this sort of accidental life, if you will. And then Human Design gives you, with your imprint of when you were born, kind of like astrology, it gives you an idea of your personality, your characteristics, sort of what you're here to do as Dharma, how you're affected by the many moving elements in our solar system, and like elements. That one's pretty inclusive, but that might not speak to you. And then there's gene keys, which I think is really cool. It's we have 64 DNA building blocks. There's 64 gene keys. When you're born, you're sort of imprinted with your DNA is your code. In the funniest and funnest way I could think about it is, if you were a player in a video game, these would be your cheat codes. And it's also still kind of like, you read it, you take it, if it makes sense to you, and if it feels good, you go with it. If it doesn't, then you just leave it behind and then you move on. But there is, in a way, it would say, for instance, your intention, your dharma and your purpose in life could be that you're meant to be a teacher or a role model. And when you're in your highest version of that, you're effortlessly influential, and you don't force anything upon anybody. And when you're in your most shadowed self, you feel furthest away from who you actually are, you tend to press your opinion on others and be too assertive with trying to change other people's minds. Teaching isn't that. Teaching is giving you information, knowledge, and then your ability to turn it into wisdom is your excitement, enthusiasm about it, your perspective of being present when you're hearing the information, how much you value the information. All of these things are a lot more personal, and because I've worked one-on-one with people a lot, because I am my own individual, like one-on-one study for myself and with another teacher, really is my idea of a formula for just, it feels good. I don't necessarily do good with like an entire community of people. I never do good on the Facebook groups, as like, even when I'm in the course myself. I would most ideally like to learn information and then contemplate and articulate it with somebody else, and give me the opportunity to witness through somebody being present and listen, and then me being present and listen to how they're articulating almost probably a similar concept. And to me, I think that verbal way of teaching and learning is the most valuable, and I have no idea how to do it. That's why I will call myself a teacher in training, but this gives me some kind of idea and where to start and where I can welcome you into my space. Thank you for being here.